300 people were watching my husband hold up a microphone and turn me into a punchline. "Let's start the bidding at $20, he said, grinning at the crowd like he just told the funniest joke of the night. "Who wants this useless wife?" The laughter came fast, rolling through the ballroom, like it had been waiting for permission. Someone near the bar raised a paddle just to keep the joke going. I stood there in the blue dress I'd bought for this exact night, and I did not cry. I did not argue, I only looked at him. Then a voice from the back of the room said $2 million, and everything stopped. I want to tell you how I got there, standing on a small stage in front of everyone we knew, because it didn't happen in a single moment. It happened over 27 years, one small eraser at a time, until I was so used to being invisible that I almost didn't notice the night it became official. I had spent the entire day putting that gala together. Every centerpiece, every seating chart, every phone call to the caterer who kept getting the count wrong. That was mine. I'd been doing it for 11 years. Ever since Gregory's charity foundation grew large enough to need a real event instead of a dinner in someone's backyard. I never asked for credit. I told myself that was fine, that some people work behind the curtain, and some people stand in the light, and I had made my peace with which one I was. Gregory arrived 40 minutes late, the way he always did now, sweeping in with that easy smile that made rooms rearrange themselves around him. He kissed my cheek in front of the board members, said something about how I always managed to pull it together, and then spent the next hour taking credit for choices I had made alone, right down to the wine. I used to mind that. By last year, I mostly didn't. You'd be surprised what a person can get used to. It was during dinner that the jokes started the way they always did once he'd had a few glasses of the good scotch he liked to keep near him at these things. He told the table I was old-fashioned, that I still balanced a checkbook by hand, that I'd probably never sent a text message longer than 4 words. Everyone laughed. I smiled because that's what you do, and passed the breadbasket to Mrs. Alderman, who patted my hand like she felt sorry for me, which somehow stung more than the joke itself. "She's the least exciting woman in this room," Gregory said at one point loud enough for 3 tables to hear. "And I mean that with love." He always added that last part with love, like it was a receipt that made the whole transaction legitimate. I don't know exactly when the auction idea started. I think it was Gregory's business partner Tom, who does these charity bachelor auction bits at other events, dates, and dinners with local minor celebrities, all in good fun, all for a good cause. I think someone suggested it would be funny to do one with married couples instead. I think Gregory thought it was hilarious. I remember him grabbing my hand halfway through dessert, pulling me up onto the small stage they'd set up for the band, and I remember thinking in the half-second before I understood what was happening that maybe he wanted to make a toast, announce something kind, say something true. 3. Instead, he took the microphone from the band leader, put his other hand on my shoulder, like I was a piece of furniture he was showing off, and said the words that ended 27 years of pretending I didn't notice. "Let's start at $20. The room laughed the way rooms laugh when they've had enough wine. And they trust the man holding the microphone. I looked out at 300 faces I had hosted. Fed remembered the birthdays of sent thank you notes to by hand, and every single one of them was laughing at me being sold for $20 like a joke prop at a white elephant party. I did not run off the stage. I did not throw my glass of wine in his face, though God knows some small tired part of me wanted to. I simply stood there, spine straight, hands folded, and let it happen. Because I had learned a long time ago that dignity is the one thing a room full of laughing people cannot take from you unless you hand it to them yourself. Someone near the back raised a paddle as a joke. $20, they called out. And a few more people laughed. And then the room went quiet all at once, the way a room does when something real interrupts something fake. $2 million. The voice came from the back, calm, unhurried. The kind of voice that has never once needed to be loud to be heard. Every head in that ballroom turned at the same time. Gregory's hand slid off my shoulder like it had gone cold. I searched the crowd and found him standing near the entrance, a tall man in a gray suit I did not recognize, watching me with an expression I couldn't yet read. Not pity, not amusement, something closer to reverence, which confused me more than anything else that had happened all night. I had never seen him before in my life. Gregory laughed a short, nervous sound and said something about a generous donor, but nobody was listening to him anymore. The man in gray had already begun walking toward the stage, unhurried the whole room, parting around him, like he was the only person who mattered. And for reasons I couldn't explain, I felt my heart begin to pound, not with fear, but with the strange sudden sense that my life was about to change, and I had absolutely no say in how. He stopped a few feet from the stage and looked at me the way you'd look at something you'd been searching for a very long time. Up close, he was older than I'd first thought, maybe 60, with gray at his temples, and the kind of quiet stillness that made everyone around him seem too loud by comparison. He didn't look at Gregory at all. He looked only at me. "My name is Daniel Whitmore," he said, and I heard a small collective intake of breath ripple through the crowd behind me, because apparently that name meant something to everyone in the room except me. "I hope you'll forgive the interruption." Gregory recovered his voice first, stepping forward with his hand extended, and that salesman's smile snapping back into place like a light switch. "Daniel Whitmore. Of course, we're honored we didn't know you'd be joining us tonight. Your generosity toward the foundation is—" "I didn't come for your foundation," Daniel said, and his voice was still calm, still, even, but something in it made Gregory's hand drop back to his side without being shaken. "I came because I heard your wife would be here." The room had gone so quiet I could hear the ice shifting in someone's glass 3 tables away. Gregory laughed again, that same nervous sound, and glanced at me like he expected me to explain this to produce some story that made sense of a strange man offering $2 million for a joke he himself had started. "I'm sorry. Have you two met Angela? Do you know Mr. Whitmore?" "No," I said, because it was true, and because I had never once in 27 years given Gregory a reason to doubt my word, and I wasn't about to start in front of 300 people. Daniel turned to me then, and something in his face softened the way a person's face softens when they finally arrive somewhere after a very long drive. "Mrs. Simmons, I know this must feel strange. I promise you, it isn't what it looks like." He paused, glanced once at the microphone still dangling from Gregor's hand, and then back at me. "Would you allow me to take you to dinner tomorrow evening? I have something I need to tell you, and it isn't the kind of thing that belongs in a room like this." I should have said no. Every instinct I'd spent decades training told me to say no, to smooth this over, to protect Gregory's evening, even after what he'd just done to me on that stage. But I looked at Daniel Whitmore's face, and I saw something there I hadn't seen, directed at me in longer than I could remember. Not pity, not amusement, not the mild, tolerant affection Gregory offered me on his better days. I saw respect, plain and unembarrassed. "All right," I said. "Tomorrow evening." The whispers started before we'd even stepped off the stage. I could hear fragments of it as Gregory guided me back to our table, with a hand pressed too firmly against my back. "Who is that? Do you know him?" $2 million for her. And I understood distantly that I had just become the most interesting thing to happen at one of Gregory's galas in 11 years, and not for any reason he would have chosen. He waited until we were in the car, the valet ticket still in his jacket pocket, before he asked the question I could feel building in him the entire ride down in the elevator. "Do you know him?" His voice was tight, careful, a man trying very hard to sound like he wasn't worried. "No, Gregory, I told you the truth in there. I've never met him." $2 million, Angela, for a joke. That's not normal. That's not, people don't do that. He gripped the steering wheel like it owed him an explanation. "What did you do, run into him at the pharmacy, the grocery store, something?" "I have no idea who he is," I said again, and I meant it, though some part of me had already begun turning the evening over like a stone, looking for the underside of it, the thing I hadn't seen yet. He didn't believe me. I could tell by the way he went quiet for the rest of the drive. And by the way, once we were home, he disappeared into his study instead of coming up to bed. I lay awake a long time that night, staring at the ceiling, replaying the sound of that voice from the back of the room, $2 million, and trying to place it somewhere in my memory. It wasn't there. I had genuinely never met the man. What I didn't know, lying in that bed with my husband's study light still glowing faintly under the door down the hall, was that Gregory had already called Margaret, his executive assistant, from the car. I didn't know he'd asked her to find out everything she could about Daniel Whitmore before morning, his business dealings, his marriages, and most of all, any connection at all between his name and mine. And I certainly didn't know that by the time the sun came up, Margaret would call Gregory back with something that unsettled him far more than an affair ever could have, proof that Daniel Whitmore had been quietly searching for a woman named Angela Simmons for years. Daniel chose a small restaurant I'd never heard of, tucked into a quiet street away from the places Gregory and I usually went, the kind of place where the tables sat far enough apart that conversation stayed private. He stood when I walked in, which almost nobody did anymore, and pulled out my chair before the host could reach it. For a long moment after we'd ordered, he didn't speak. He just looked at me across the candlelight with an expression I still didn't have a name for. "I want to apologize for last night," he finally said. "I know it must have looked theatrical. That wasn't my intention. I've simply been trying to find you for a long time, and when I saw what your husband was doing, I couldn't stand by and watch it happen." "You still haven't told me how you know me," I said. "I've gone over every year of my life since dinner, and I can't find you in any of them." "You wouldn't remember me," he said. "But I think if I tell you the story, you might remember someone else." He took a slow breath, the way people do when they're about to say something they've rehearsed for years. 30 years ago, you were a young elementary school teacher. Do you remember a rainy afternoon sometime in the fall, when you found a teenage girl crying outside the bus station downtown? Something moved in my chest, a door creaking open on a room I hadn't visited in decades. "There was a girl," I said slowly. 15, maybe 16. She was soaked through. I almost didn't stop. I had papers to grade. I was exhausted. It was pouring rain, but she looked so frightened. I could see her now more clearly than I'd expected to. Huddled under the bus station awning in a jacket too thin for the weather, flinching every time a car slowed down near the curb. I bought her dinner. I remember that. Some diner a few blocks away. Her name was Rachel, Daniel said, and his voice caught just barely on the name. Rachel Whitmore. She was my younger sister. I set down my fork. The restaurant seemed to go very quiet around us. "She'd run away from our stepfather's house," Daniel continued. "Things there were not safe. I was already grown living across the country, and I didn't know how bad it had gotten until much later, until it was almost too late. Rachel told me years afterward that she'd been planning to get on a bus that night and simply disappear. She didn't care where it went. She just wanted to be gone." He paused, and I watched him steady himself before he went on. "And then a stranger sat down next to her in the rain and asked if she was hungry. Diff." I remembered more now, staying with her long past when I should have gone home, calling a woman I trusted at the county social services office, instead of the general hotline sitting in a hard plastic chair at 2:00 in the morning, until someone reliable could take her somewhere safe. I remembered visiting her at the group home a few times after that, bringing books, checking on her grades. I remembered losing touch eventually. The way you do life moving forward, the way it always does. "I helped her finish school," I said quietly. "We wrote letters for a couple of years, then I got married, moved twice, and I'm ashamed to say I lost track of her. I think about her sometimes. I always wondered what happened." "She became a lawyer," Daniel said, and something like pride broke through the grief in his voice. "Foster care advocacy mostly. She built a national organization around it. Group homes, legal aid for kids aging out of the system, emergency shelters. She used to say the whole thing started with a diner and a stranger who didn't have to stop, but did." He reached into his jacket and set an envelope on the table between us, unopened. "She died 8 months ago. Cancer. Near the end, she made me promise her one thing: find the woman from the bus station. Tell her she saved my life." I put my hand over my mouth. I hadn't cried in that ballroom the night before. Not once, not through the laughter or the auction, or my own husband's voice putting a price on me. But I cried now quietly at a small table, in a restaurant I'd never been to, over a girl I'd nearly forgotten, and a debt I never knew I was owed. The $2 million wasn't charity, Daniel said gently. I want you to understand that I didn't do it for your husband's foundation, and I didn't do it to embarrass him. Though I confess I didn't mind if it did. I did it because for 30 years everyone in your life has decided what you were worth without ever really looking at you. I wanted just once for a roomful of people to see the truth of it. I wiped my eyes with the napkin, my hands unsteady. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything tonight, he said. Just take this. He slid the envelope toward me. It's from Rachel. She wrote it before she passed in case I ever found you. I haven't read it. It isn't mine to read. I held the envelope in both hands, like it might dissolve if I gripped it too hard. And I understood sitting there, with the candle burning low, and the rain starting again against the restaurant windows, that whatever was inside it was going to change the shape of my life. I just didn't yet know how much. Oh, how. I opened the envelope, alone in the guest room, where I'd taken to sleeping since the night of the gala, because I couldn't bring myself to read Rachel's last words to me, with Gregory's voice carrying through the wall, asking again and again who Daniel Whitmore really was to me. The handwriting was small and careful, a lawyer's handwriting. And it started simply, Dear Angela, if you're reading this, my brother finally found you, and I hope it wasn't too late. I want you to know that the woman who bought me dinner on the worst night of my life became the reason I believed for the rest of it that strangers could still be kind. Everything I built because of 1 hour you probably don't even remember spending with me. I've left instructions with my attorneys. I hope you'll accept what I'm leaving you not as payment because you never asked for anything, but as proof that kindness doesn't disappear, it multiplies. It just takes a while to come back around. Attached to the letter were legal documents I had to read twice to understand. Rachel hadn't simply left me money. She'd left me a position, a seat on the board of the foundation she'd spent her life building, along with a controlling share of its direction going forward. Leadership, purpose, a say in where hundreds of thousands of dollars went every year toward shelters and legal aid and scholarships for kids like the girl I'd once bought a diner dinner. I sat on the edge of that unfamiliar bed for a long time, holding papers that suddenly made my hands feel like they belonged to someone else. Downstairs, Gregory was building something too, though it wasn't nearly as generous. He'd hired a private investigator by Wednesday, a man named Foster, who specialized, according to Margaret, in matrimonial cases. Gregory was convinced in the particular way a guilty man is often convinced of other people's guilt, that Daniel and I had a history he simply hadn't uncovered yet. An affair he assumed something sordid enough to explain $2 million and a private dinner. He wanted proof before I could, in his words, spring anything on him in front of the lawyers. What Foster found instead unsettled him far more than an affair would have. He found teachers I'd worked alongside 20 years earlier, who remembered me keeping granola bars in my desk drawer for the kids who came to school hungry. He found a woman named Diane, a widow I'd sat with every week for 2 years after her husband died. Back when Gregory was too busy building his company to notice, I disappeared most Tuesday afternoons. He found 3 former foster children, now grown, who described a woman who'd shown up at their school plays because no one else would. He found a veteran named Harold who credited me, of all people, with helping him find the paperwork office that finally got his benefits approved after the VA had turned him away twice. None of it was dramatic. None of it was a scandal. It was just decades of small, unremarkable kindnesses that had never once made it into a conversation at Gregory's dinner table, because I had never thought they were interesting enough to mention, and he had never once asked what I did with my time that wasn't spent serving his. Will Foster's report landed on Gregory's desk the same week the video went viral. I don't know who filmed it. Some guest with a phone, probably capturing the auction the way people capture everything now without thinking twice. But by Thursday, the clip of Gregory holding that microphone, grinning, saying, "Let's start the bidding at $20" had been watched 4 million times. The captions people added were not kind to him. Neither were the comments. A late-night host mentioned it in his monologue. A women's advocacy account reposted it with the caption, This is what casual cruelty looks like when it's dressed in a tuxedo. And that version alone crossed 1 million views by Friday morning. Sponsors began calling the company. 2 luxury developers who'd signed contracts with Gregory's firm the previous spring quietly asked their lawyers to review the exit clauses. A journalist, who'd covered the gala for a local business magazine, reached out to me directly for comment, and I declined because I had nothing prepared to say, and no interest in saying anything unprepared. Gregory came home Friday evening, looking like a man who'd aged 5 years in 5 days. He didn't ask about Daniel. He didn't ask about the envelope I'd been careful to keep locked in the guest room dresser. He sat at the kitchen island with his phone face down in front of him and said very quietly, "It's everywhere, Angela. I can't make it stop." I didn't answer him right away. I thought about Rachel's letter upstairs, about the strange quiet power of one honest hour spent with a frightened stranger, and about how differently things might have gone for Gregory if he'd ever once in 27 years wondered what I did with mine. The phone rang before I could decide what to say. Gregory answered it, listened for a long moment, and I watched the last of the color drain out of his face. "The board wants an emergency meeting," he said. "Monday morning, all of them." The board meeting lasted 90 minutes, and Gregory told me about it that night in pieces, the way a man described something he's still too stunned to organize into a full story. 7 directors sat around the long table in the glass-walled conference room. He'd once been so proud of the one, with the view of the harbor he liked to show off to new clients. And none of them, he said, would quite look him in the eye. It was Bill Ashford, the oldest of them, who finally said what the rest were thinking. "This isn't about the joke, Gregory. Jokes get forgiven. This is about what the joke told everyone about who you actually are, when you think no one important is watching." 2 of the luxury developers who'd been circling exit clauses all week made their decision official by Monday afternoon. A hotel group that had been finalizing a contract for a new development pulled out entirely, citing in the careful language lawyers' concerns about brand alignment. By Wednesday, the company's stock, private as it was, had lost enough projected value that Gregory stopped mentioning numbers to me at all. He came to me on Thursday with a television offer in his hand, a morning show that wanted them both, Gregory and Angela Simmons, to sit together and set the record straight. He'd already told the producer yes. He asked me to just be there to smile, to tell people it was a joke between us, that I hadn't been hurt, that we were fine. I looked at him for a long moment before I answered. "I won't lie for anyone anymore, Gregory, not even you." He didn't yell. I think some part of him had already stopped expecting me to say yes to anything he asked. He just sat down heavily at the kitchen table and put his head in his hands. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt something close to pity for him, though not enough to change my answer. I called Daniel later that week, not about the interview, but about the envelope, about Rachel's letter, about the strange new weight of responsibility I didn't yet know how to carry. He didn't try to talk me into anything. He simply said, "Take your time. The foundation isn't going anywhere, but if you ever want to see what it actually does, I could take you to one of the shelters." I said yes before I'd fully thought it through. The shelter was smaller than I expected. A converted apartment building on the edge of town with cheerful curtains someone had clearly chosen on purpose, trying to make temporary feel less like an emergency. Daniel introduced me to the director, a tired, kind woman named Priya, who walked me through the halls, explaining who stayed there, and for how long, and what they needed, that they never had enough of. That was where I met Lena Brooks. She was maybe 28, sitting on a bench in the small courtyard, with a boy of about 4 asleep against her shoulder, and a girl, a little older, coloring quietly beside her. She had the specific exhaustion I recognized instantly. The kind that isn't about being tired so much as about having spent every ounce of yourself keeping 2 small people fed and warm and unaware of how close to the edge things really were. She looked up at me the way people look up when they've learned not to expect anything good from strangers. And something in her face reminded me so precisely of a girl standing under a bus station awning 30 years ago that I had to steady myself against the doorframe. I sat down next to her, I didn't ask her story right away. I just asked if the children had eaten, and when she said not, since breakfast, I walked to the corner store myself, and came back with sandwiches and juice boxes, and sat with them while they ate the way I once sat in a diner booth with a frightened 15-year-old, and let her decide in her own time how much she wanted to tell me. By the time Lena finally spoke, it came out slowly. A husband who drank a shelter 3 towns over that hadn't had space. 2 months of sleeping in a car before someone told her about Priya's building. I listened the way I'd learned to listen decades earlier, without flinching, without rushing her toward a version of the story that would be easier to hear. I left that afternoon, having arranged through the foundation for Lena's rent to be covered for 6 months, while she finished a certification course she'd started and abandoned twice already. It wasn't a large thing, not by the numbers Rachel's foundation dealt in. But driving home, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, maybe decades. Sitting beside Gregory at some gala he'd built his name on, I felt useful, not decorative, not a place setting, useful. Gregory noticed the change before I said a single word about it. He noticed it in the way I stopped waiting for his schedule before making my own plans, in the way I no longer checked my phone for his approval before deciding what mattered to me. One evening, watching me come home late from a foundation meeting, energized in a way he hadn't seen in years, he finally said it out loud quietly, almost to himself. "You don't need any of this anymore, do you?" Me, the company, none of it. I didn't answer him right away because I was still finding out the answer myself. But I understood, watching his face in the kitchen light, that he already knew, and that some part of him had known it was coming, long before that microphone ever reached his hand. The invitation to Rachel's Foundation Gala arrived in a cream envelope with my name on it in gold lettering. And beneath my name, a line I had to read 3 times before I believed it. Keynote speaker Angela Simmons. I called Daniel immediately, half convinced it was a mistake. "It isn't a mistake," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. The board voted unanimously. They want the founders' story told by the person who started it. Whether she remembers starting it or not, I nearly said no. Standing in front of a crowd had never been the part I wanted. I had spent a lifetime being useful from the edges of rooms, not the center of them. But I thought of Lena, 6 months into her certification course, now sending me photos of her daughter's school project, with a joy in her texts I hadn't seen in her voice the day we met. I thought of Rachel's letter still folded in my dresser drawer. Kindness doesn't disappear. It just takes a while to come back around. I said yes. The night of the gala, I dressed alone in my own apartment. Now the small one I'd moved into 6 weeks after telling Gregory I needed space to think. I chose a deep green dress, nothing like the blue one from that other ballroom a lifetime ago. And I did my own hair, and I did not once check my phone to see whether anyone approved. Bust. This time when I walked into a room full of 300 people, I wasn't seated beside a husband holding a microphone like a weapon. I was walking toward a stage where my name was already printed on the program. Daniel met me near the entrance, offered his arm, and walked me in the way. An old friend walks you into a room you're nervous about. These steady and unhurried. "You don't have to say much," he told me. "Just tell them the truth." That's all Rachel ever wanted anyone to do. When they called my name, I walked up without shaking, though my heart was pounding the entire way. I looked out at the crowd, foundation donors, former board members, a scattering of faces I recognized from the shelters we now funded across 4 states. And I told them about a rainy afternoon, outside a bus station, about a diner booth, and a frightened girl I'd nearly walked past, because I had papers to grade. I told them I hadn't thought of it as anything remarkable at the time. I told them I now believed exactly the point, that the kindnesses which change lives rarely announce themselves as important while they're happening. Then the lights dimmed, and a screen behind me came alive with faces. A woman in her 40s, a former foster child, spoke about a scholarship that let her become a nurse. A man in his 60s, the veteran named Harold, I'd forgotten Foster's investigation had even uncovered, spoke about the paperwork office and the benefits he'd almost given up trying to claim. A teacher I hadn't seen in 15 years described the granola bars in my desk drawer, tears running freely down her face as she spoke, and I found I had to press my hand against my mouth to keep my own composure. Lena appeared last, her daughter beside her, saying simply, "She sat with us. That's all. She just sat with us until it didn't feel impossible anymore." I looked out into the dark of the audience and found Gregory sitting near the back alone, in a seat he must have requested quietly, without fanfare, without expecting to be noticed. He wasn't smiling the way he smiled for cameras. He was simply watching very still, the way I had once been still on a stage he built for me. After the ceremony, as the crowd thinned and the waitstaff began clearing the tables, he found me near the coat check, and he didn't try to charm his way into the moment the way he once would have. "I watched all of it," he said. "The video tonight. All of it. 27 years, Angela, and I never once asked you what you did on your Tuesday afternoons." His voice broke slightly on the word Tuesday, and I understood he was thinking of Diane, the widow, of all the small absences he'd never questioned, because he'd never wondered where I went. "I'm sorry. Not the kind of sorry that wants something back. Just sorry. I stood beside someone extraordinary for almost 3 decades, and I never once looked up long enough to see her." I believed him. That was perhaps the strangest part of the whole evening, that after everything I could still recognize the difference between a performance and a genuine reckoning. And this finally was the latter. "Thank you for saying that," I told him, and I meant it. "I forgive you, Gregory. I want you to know that. But forgiveness isn't the same thing as going back." He nodded slowly, like a man finally accepting the shape of something he'd been trying to reshape for weeks. He didn't argue. He didn't ask me to reconsider. He simply stood there in his good suit, looking older than I'd ever seen him look, and let me say goodnight. I walked out of that gala alone, into a cool evening full of the particular quiet that comes after something important has finally been said out loud. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, being alone didn't feel like a loss. It felt like the beginning of something that belonged entirely to me. 6 months passed the way real change usually does, quietly in increments too small to notice, until you looked back and saw how far you'd come. Rachel's foundation had grown under my direction in ways I hadn't expected when I first opened that unassuming envelope. We'd opened 2 new shelters, one in a small town that hadn't had emergency housing in over a decade. The scholarship program Rachel started with a handful of recipients each year, now funded 30, mostly kids, aging out of foster care with nowhere steady to land. Lena finished her certification in the spring and started work at a pediatric clinic. 3 weeks later, she sent me a photograph of her name badge, Lena Brooks RN, with 3 exclamation points and nothing else. And I kept it taped inside my desk drawer, where I'd once kept granola bars for children. I never expected to remember me. I had a purpose now that didn't depend on anyone's permission. That was the part I hadn't known to hope for. Gregory resigned as chairman that same spring, and it surprised people who didn't know the whole story, though it didn't surprise me. The board hadn't forced him out. Not in the end. The numbers had recovered somewhat by then, the initial outrage cooling the way these things eventually do. He resigned because he told me over coffee one of the last times we spoke as anything resembling a married couple. He didn't want to spend the second half of his life being a man who'd only learned decency after losing everything that mattered to him. He wanted to rebuild something smaller. He said something honest. Even if it meant starting over at 55 with a fraction of what he'd had. We separated with more grace than either of us had shown each other in years. No courtroom shouting, no dividing of assets like weapons in a war. Just 2 people finally honest with each other, signing papers at a lawyer's office and shaking hands afterward, like colleagues closing out a long, complicated project. He asked, before I left that office for the last time, as his wife, whether I thought we could have been happy if he'd simply paid attention sooner. I told him I didn't know, and that I'd stopped needing to know, and I think that answer surprised him more than anger would have. On a quiet Sunday in early autumn, Daniel and I drove out to the cemetery, where Rachel was buried a modest stone under an oak tree, just beginning to turn gold at the edges. Daniel had brought white lies, her favorite, he told me, and set them carefully against the base of the headstone, while I stood a step behind him, giving him the moment alone that grief sometimes needs before it can be shared. When he stepped back, I knelt down myself and rested my hand flat against the cool stone, feeling the carved letters of her name under my palm. "You thought I saved your life," I said quietly, not caring that Daniel could hear me, because I think some part of him needed to hear it too. "But I've been thinking about it for months now, and I believe you saved mine right back. I just didn't know it yet. It took 30 years for the debt to come due, and I got the better end of the bargain by far." Daniel didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He simply put his hand briefly on my shoulder, the way you comfort someone who doesn't need comforting so much as company. And we stood there together a while longer in the gold autumn light, before turning to walk back toward the car. That was when I saw her, a young woman, maybe 19 or 20, sitting alone on a bench just outside the cemetery gates, a duffel bag at her feet, her arms wrapped around herself against the wind. Though the day wasn't especially cold, she had the particular stillness of someone trying very hard not to be noticed, and the particular fear of someone who has learned that being noticed rarely goes well for her. Phil, I recognized that stillness. I had seen it once before 30 years ago under a bus station awning in the rain, and I had carried the memory of it without even realizing for every year since. I didn't hesitate. I walked over, sat down on the far end of the bench, close enough to be present, far enough not to crowd her, and I asked the only question that had ever mattered in moments like this one. "Would you like to sit with me for a while?" She looked at me startled, wary, and then slowly something in her shoulders loosened just slightly, the way a held breath finally lets go. She nodded, and the cycle that started with a stranger and a diner booth 30 years ago began again quietly, the way it always had, without an audience, without applause, without anyone keeping score. Sometimes people laugh while they decide your worth. They hold up the microphone. They set the price. They wait for the room to agree with them. But life has a way of letting time settle the real account, long after the laughter has faded and the room has emptied out. And when it finally does, you learn the truth of it. Kindness is always worth more than those who mock it could ever afford to pay. I want to know what you think happens to Angela next. Does she ever open her heart to someone new? Or has she found everything she needs in the life she's built for herself? Leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from tonight. We have so many more stories like this one waiting for you. So, make sure you subscribe so you never miss a moment like this. Let's keep this journey going.